Hi students, welcome to lesson number 22 on ecofeminism. Now the introduction for the lesson. Ecofeminism can be simply explained as an intersection of feminism and ecology. The popularity of ecofeminism is growing today, especially among young women, and it is slowly eclipsing the lengthy time when it was underappreciated or little understood. All ecofeminist ideologies were regarded as identifying women with nature and as a sort of biology. Women and ecology are not the same thing, though being an ecofeminist does not mean that women have a deeper connection to life and nature than males do. There are women who are averse to these new types of awareness and males who dedicate their lives to protecting the environment and animals. Statistically speaking, women do predominate in environmental movements and animal rights organization on a global scale. So, we can think of women's interest in protecting the environment as a constructivist perspective on gender subjectivity rather than as natural consequence of their gender. A vast variety of people as well as trends related to the socialization of predetermined activities and attitudes are shown to us in reality. Women have traditionally cared for the most vulnerable and maintained the material infrastructure of the home, developing statistically speaking a rational subjectivity, attentive to others and exhibiting greater affection. In general, women have not historically had access to weapons. The conditions arise to arouse their interest in the defense of nature and other living things when these qualities are combined with pertinent information and a critical approach to dominant discourses. And the objective of this lesson is that this lesson will enable the students to explain the approaching issues of gender and the environment. They can critically analyze the idea of ecofeminism as theory and as a practical solution, and they can also describe how a larger system or culture subjugates and oppresses the environment and women. And they can also explain how different cultures come to view the environment and the conflicts in this multiple perception. Now, what is ecofeminism? Ecofeminism comes to regard an association between women and nature as essential to the way both are treated. For both, women and nature are mistreated and subjugated, and as Francois of Eubon, the French feminist credited with the emergence of the idea of ecofeminism, comes to note, this is because of the male system. She suggests that the only way to save the environment is through the destruction of male power by women. Yet, ecofeminism is much more than a mere disapproval and destruction of the male power. It is very much embedded in the way women are closely associated with the environment in the multiple ways in which they are perceived. And within feminism too, there is no one way of looking at this relation, for as a theory, ecofeminism is linked to diverse thoughts and practices. Now, let us look at the theoretical debates on ecofeminism. Different strands of the feminist movements have had varying effects on ecofeminism as a movement. As a result, it is observed that liberal feminism is least able to be associated with ecology because its focus is still mostly on white middle class issues. Furthermore, despite the fact that radical feminism emphasizes the connection between women and nature as a rallying cry in its emancipative politics, the justification is viewed as being far too oversimplified to advance a movement. Social ecofeminism, on the other hand, strike me as an intriguing new movement with Marxist roots that is built on the understanding that gender is socially created and acknowledges the urgent need to create conceptual tools that will examine ecological and social change in relation to gender. Key economic concepts are outlined by Beena Agarwal. The dominance and exploitation of nature are fundamentally related to start. Second, women are perceived as being closer to nature and males as being closer to culture under patriarchal philosophy. So, women are viewed as inferior to males because nature is perceived as inferior to society. Third, both nature and women have been subjected to oppression and dominance. Women have a crucial role to play in uniting human and non-human nature by putting a stop to nature's dominance. Fourth, so in order to build a more just and equal society, the environmental movement and the feminist movement must work together. These both movements can provide a shared perspective praxis and therefore because of their many similarities. In this sense, ecofeminism is an eco-feminist movement with the ideological foundation that places the blame of women's oppression and subordination on current system of thought, behavior and representation. And those who support this movement are urging both men and women to reconsider and reinvent their interactions with nature. So, in response to the widespread environmental degradation and its effects on women, ecofeminism was born. It is interesting to note that in the West, the association between a painful and exploitative environment and a subjugated and oppressed sex developed. However, different schools of thought within ecofeminism emerge as a result of the need to examine cross-cultural debates and challenges in order to develop a realistic theory of action. And this was also a response to widespread ecological movements in underdeveloped nations where the connection between nature and women were perceived as more important. Now, let us look at the nature-culture approach. The nature-culture approach looks at the close relation that women share with nature and the resultant insubordination of both nature and women. In trying to understand the reason behind the insubordination of women in society, West Sherry Ortner identifies 3 levels of the problem, and the first level deals with the universal reality of women's lower status in society, which is supported socially and culturally. Ortner here wants to investigate the causes behind it. And the second category includes cultural symbolism, wherein the ideas and social structures that connect to women yet vary from culture to culture. And the third, that what methods do women use to rebel against or attempt to repress this oppressive and insubordinate organization. So, here according to Ortner, when investigating the inferior status of women, he is specifically looking at universals or facts that apply to all societies that disadvantage women. However, it is crucial to realize that the categories of nature and culture are themselves cultural categories, social constructions, before one starts to link women with nature and men with culture. Ortner contends that culture implicitly affirms the distinction between nature, natural occurrences and culture. So, here women are positioned within the framework of nature primarily according to their physical and physiological makeup. So, it is believed that by placing restrictions on her body and its functions, conditions her social duties and psychic constitution in a way that excludes her from cultural functions. So, women continue to be connected to nature, but they are also significant contributors to social and cultural development because to their socialization role. Despite being restricted to domestic environments for child bearing and child rearing, like boys' socialization is taken over by males, once they reach puberty, while that of a girl is continued with their mothers, they are essential actors in the transfer of cultural values to the younger generation. However, this cultural mediation may be reduced to a secondary concern. So, the participation of women in the domestic sphere is therefore viewed as a sort of lower culture in contrast to the higher culture that males are a part of and cultivate, such as religion, law, the arts, etc. And according to Ortner and according to Saleh, feminism should be a tactic for social action that involves both men and women. Saleh also observed that despite the development of such technology, women are still consigned to their natural position as housekeepers. So, she is clear in stating that this viewpoint originates from a skewed Western perspective that disregards the fact that poor third world women who live and work with their own labor, that is close to nature, lack access to any such labor saving technology. She also maintains that a key component of the ecofeminist movement is a recognition of the feminine role as caretakers and the foundation of families. But Vandana Shiva finds the Western ecofeminist movement as lacking in the way it presents the association between women and nature. And her formulation of a more inclusive and dynamic theory draws on Indian cosmological and philosophical thinking to project a new relationship between gender and nature. Having examined the movement within the Western context, let us now try to understand or turn to India to examine indigenous approaches to ecofeminism. Now, let us relate ecofeminism to Prakriti and Shakti. Even more firmly ingrained than in Western thought is the link between women and nature in ancient Indian philosophy. The dichotomy between the sexes and hence between nature and culture does not exist in Indian philosophical thought, in contrast to how it exists in the West. This, according to Vandana Shiva, is the distinguishing feature of a society that views both the male and female as expression of the same person and not as distinct from one another. According to Indian cosmology, the world is created through a conflict between cohesiveness and disintegration as well as destruction and creation. The dynamic force that emerges from this process is known as Shakti, and it literally serves as both the origin and the encompassing force of everything. And Prakriti or nature is an expression of Shakti or the feminine principle in the form of an energy or power. Accordingly, Shakti, the feminine, and the creative principle of the universe can be seen in both the animate and the inanimate nature. So, when combined with the male principle or the Purusha, Prakriti produces the world. As a result, Purusha, Prakriti or man and nature are a duality in one. So, they are inseparable complements of one another in nature, in woman, in man, rather than being in opposition to one another. So, according to Vandana Shiva, the idea that women should only be associated with nature is not new, but rather the roots of women's exploitation and subordination in nature. She considers Baerbock's argument to be typical of Western feminist philosophy, which acknowledges the conflict and duality of the sexes and further marginalizes women as weak and hence oppressed. In actuality, Baerbock believes that masculinizing women is the solution to the women problem. In a society where women are free to adopt masculine principles, liberation will manifest. So, here Shiva finds this formulation to be problematic, particularly given the societal constructions of the categories of masculine and feminine. They have been positioned within biological essentialism by Western gender theory. So, Shiva, however, is a proponent of an alternative school of thought that examines a transgender philosophy in which the feminine principle is present in both males and women. So, this feminine concept, one cannot really discern the masculine from the feminine, persons from nature, Purusha from Prakriti is a principle of activity and creativity in nature. So, there is no other place where this is more clear than in ancient ideologies, particularly those that may be found in the third world, where women and nature are related not in passivity, but in creativity and in the sustaining of life. So, here Vandana Shiva affirms that women do have a unique relationship with nature, despite the fact that men and women approach nature in a similar way. And the following examples illustrates this. Women consider themselves to be connected to nature in the manner they produce and refill the land and civilization, which shows how their interaction with nature were reciprocal. Second, by both using and returning some of nature's resources, women work in harmony with it. Last but not least, women are producers in nature who support relationships in society. So, there are supporters of the first productive economy as well as those who want a subsistence based one. So, in such a setting, colonialism is to blame for any divide and subjugation of women and environment. And here Vandana Shiva believes that colonialism is to blame for the exploitation of women and the ruin of the natural world. And the synthesis between nature's masculine and feminine principles has been disrupted by science and technology, and it has been replaced by an unequal and hierarchical relationships. So, development is seen as maldevelopment for women and nature by perpetuating domination and centralization through patriarchal control. Take for instance, the colonial destruction of forests in India. According to Shiva, India's forests are of representation of life and fertility, and she has referred to as Aryani, or the goddess of the forest, and she is worshipped in various places under various titles. The forest has long been revered and maintained as a sacred grove because it is the highest embodiment of harmony and common habitat. This represents the locals' profound ecological understanding, and the colonial rule was established with the destruction of the natural resources of India such as forest. And the displacement of traditional indigenous knowledge and the subsistence economy of women begin with the colonial practice of commercial forestry and the scientific management of forests, which involved the marking of a forest area as reserved and protected. The aforementioned approach include eroding forest and local people's right to their produce. As living examples of negative repercussions of progress and as possessors of a holistic and ecological understanding of what ecofeminism entails. So, here Shiva emphasizes that the participation of underprivileged women and communities becomes particularly crucial, and the third world women are the most prominent example of such a category. Shiva's theory, in Beena Agarwal's opinion, differs from the Western feminist perspective in that it examines elements that are later left out in their formulation, particularly the connection between development and developmental change and their effects on the environment, as well as the element of people's dependence on the environment for their way of life. Yet, the hypothesis is not without certain limitations. One, Shiva's notions lumps together all women from the third world into one group, and according to Beena Agarwal, this type of generalization that obliterates cultural, economic and social difference is also a form of essentialism. And all third women viewed as being close to nature, especially in terms of their dependence and understanding. Both of the two inside India itself, the theory does not take into consideration various historical, cultural and social processes and the concepts that may have altered the relationship with nature. Other Indian philosophical and religious traditions are not subject to the same dependence on Hinduism. So, there are many different schools of thought outside of Hinduism itself that might not agree with what Shiva proposes in her theory. 3. According to Agarwal, Shiva ignores the effect that pre-colonial structures and practices had on both the environment and women. Shiva ignores the long history of caste and class inequality in Indian society and instead cites colonial oppression and the introduction of modern scientific idea as the main causes. So, the criticism point to the fact that within ecofeminism there is still space for change and reformulation. Now, let us look at the environmental activism from Chipko movement and other beyond the Chipko movement movements. Interestingly, the cause that ecofeminism intends to fight for around the world has been women-led environmental action. In India, as way back as the 1970s, way of environmental movements spread thanks to dedicated involvement of women fighting to safeguard their environment and resources. The most famous of these was the Chipko movement that gathered steam in the hills of India, affecting village after village. Radha Kumar lays out a data line of the movement to show how much the movement of involvement of women affected the way the government framed its policies around environmental policies. In Gopeshwar, in the northern Indian district of Chamauli, the movement got its start. A sporting goods contractor from Allahabad had come to cut some ash trees in the nearby forest. So, the women of the hamlet began by giving them a hug or chipko in Hindi. Following this, Chandi Prasad Bhatt, one of the movement's founders, persuaded the rainy villagers to protest the auctioning off of the forest next to their village. The men of the hamlet decided to approach the administration, even after which the indiscriminate chopping of trees began. Seeing this, the women led by a 60-year-old widow, Gauri Devi, went ahead and hugged the trees, foiling the attempts of the contractors to cut them. Again in June 1975, women stopped the felling of trees in the forest near Gopeshwar village by clinging to them. The Chipko movement spread in many areas of Uttaranchal, especially in the districts of Chamauli and Tarhi Garawal. The movement started to organize itself and took the name the Sauli Gram Swarajya Mandal. It assisted in establishing women's groups like the Mahila Mangal Dals. This helped women in becoming a part of the way in which they could claim their rights to decide what was done to the forest and fields. The distinctiveness of the environmental movement is particularly evident in the fact that women have traditionally assumed leadership roles at the local level, with men frequently refusing to encourage their engagement. So, the fight to protect the environment has frequently adopted an anti-men stance. The men have used threats and physical violence to force women to follow their lead in disputes over grazing and rights to resources. Often in support of the contractors, the men and the panchayats have tried to dissuade environmental activists from fighting for their cause. Interestingly, the Chipko movement takes on different concerns for the objectives of activism. So, anti-mining, timber contracting and anti-alcohol movements trace their original genesis to the struggle for environmental rights. The anti-alcohol movement, for instance, is in response to the effects of alcohol addiction in rural areas. Not only does the addiction lead to violence against women, it also impacts the men's health and most importantly leads to a squandering of household income. This affects women directly, especially in rural and tribal areas. In the latter, many tribes have wild forest lands to contractors. Therefore, it is believed that the push for prohibition is essential to safeguarding both women and the environment. So, Uttarakhand Sangharshi Vahini was created in 1977 in support of prohibition. In 1983, in a mass conference organized by the group, alcoholism was shown to be a big problem. Alcohol prohibition in many places was brought about by a surge into anti-alcohol activism between 1965 and 1971. In February 1984, people in a district in Almora successfully managed to bring the justice and an agent in illicit whisky as well as the government officials who was involved in smuggling the liquor. The movement then spread to different villages where the Vahini activists went about destroying liquor shops and made liquor vendors apologize in public. In order to analyze the impact of the environmental movements in India, these three examples are presented to justify the role of women in protecting the nature. Each of those movements are over the span of at least 3 decades and show the struggle that women have to undertake to fight for their rights and those of the environment. Interestingly, the rights of women and the environment seem to complement ecofeminism each other in each of the instances discussed above. The examples are all from India, and Madhusarin looks at the politics of the forest and the role of women in environmental activism in the Kumaon Garawal region. In Uttarakhand, even though women have been closest to the environment in terms of livelihood and cultivation, yet the forests have been under the control of the men. The majority of the forest land was taken over by the British colonial rulers during the colonial rule and made inaccessible to the local population thanks to an elaborate system of scientific management of forests that classified them as reserved areas. The denotified or the conserved forest land was an attempt by the government to gain access to areas rich in natural resources. So, post independence, the government introduced the notion of one panchayats which would be involved in joint forest management. The idea of joint forest management came about through the Chipko struggle that fought for involvement of the local population with their natural resources. However, while the movement had been predominantly led by women, the panchayats in this region had historically been male dominated. Therefore, the unofficial informal community forest management was formed by women in favor of their role in safeguarding natural resources and the forests in the area. The male dominated one panchayats and the government joint forest management in the region was opposed by the CFMs. The first point of conflict began with the formation of village forest joint management, which were funded by the World Bank in association with the Uttaranchal government. Till now, autonomous one panchayats came under the control of the village forest joint managements, which was because women had began to take over the veins of the one panchayats, and with the support of government projects such as Mahila Samakhya, which attempts to empower women, they were doing an exceptional job of conserving the forest. The one forest joint management represented opposition from the village men and the forest department. In Kirakot, a village in the Someshwar valley in Uttaranchal, the women found their access to the forest blocked by a miner who was building a soapstone mine in the area. When the mine dust began to settle on their land, making it difficult for them to plant their crops and plough the field, the women launched a protest against the miner. The miner retaliated by filing criminal charges against each of the village men who had voiced their opposition to the mine's establishment. The women in turn were not scared, even though the men were, and collected money from each village household to fight the case. The contractor further tried intimidation in the form of destruction of property and stoning of the villagers' houses. Activists in return blocked the route to the quarry and did not let laborers to work in the mine. Finally, on a visit to the region, the district magistrate was impressed with the struggle of the local women and promptly advised dropping the case. This was further followed by the shutting of the mine in 1982, where a great win for the women's movement. And the infamous Bhopal gas tragedy, which you probably already familiar with because it has been in the spotlight for years since it happened in 1984, is another extremely significant example of women's involvement in the fight against human and environmental injustice. The ongoing protest by women against the Bhopal gas disaster serve as an example of the existence of ecofeminism in the current context of nature, culture, conflict. Women now make up 90:10 of the participants in the protest and demonstration of up from 80:20 previously. The women went on fighting for relief and employment even after the government settled for much less with human carbide in 1989. The activists were finally successful in obtaining rupees 360 lakh as a 3-year relief grant and government access to medical data with the election of a new government. Most crucially, they won the government support to reopen the lawsuit against Union Carbide that had been infamously settled in 1989 by the Supreme Court. They are the stories of courage and activism that have inspired feminist and environmental activists around the world. So, ecofeminists are motivated to fight for both the rights of the women and the environment by these very movements. To summarize, the lesson examines the significance of an ideology that seeks to unite the concerns of women and the environment. The lesson particularly emphasizes the elements of the ecofeminist movement listed We are demonstrating the physical characteristics of women and the social roles they play as a result of their physiological makeup that they play, connecting third world women to the environment by highlighting their reliance on it for their survival and livelihood, and in order to demonstrate how women have established themselves as the strongest advocates for environmental protection and sustainable development to date. The unit or the lesson also analyzes the environmental movement which was predominantly led by them. When the world is facing a global crisis vis-a-vis the environment, it is essential for us to understand the ways in which the environment has come to figure in our everyday lives. It is in this sense that we must also strive to protect it. It is no wonder then an important part of this course tries to look at how this linkage can be established at the levels of human relationships, especially that with gender and more specifically women.